Hi, so this is a presentation that attempts to come up with an epistemology that should hopefully be able to stand the test of time based on all the different things that have been done so far in this field. Now, just to start with a definition, epistemology is the theory of knowledge, especially with regards to its methods, validity, and scope. Epistemology is the investigation of what distinguishes justified belief from opinion. So that's a general definition for what epistemology is. All right. So when it comes to the field of epistemology, there's actually a number of different approaches, number of different opinions about how we should approach the topic. So within the field of science, there's multiple views depending on where people are coming from. Within the secular atheistic community, there's different approaches to epistemology. There's obviously other religions that have their own approaches, and within the Christian community, there's the traditional approach, which I'll kind of cover in this video. There's some approaches that are fideistic. They just take things on faith. Others are presuppositional in the sense that they choose some authority element, like the scripture, for example, and start from there and build their epistemology from there. There's the liberal approaches. There's a new approach known as reformed epistemology that tries to actually address some of the issues I'm addressing here. There's an approach based on it's based on Michael Pollanay's views called the personal knowledge approach and so on. Anyway, these are just a few. I've actually found probably close to a dozen different theories of how knowledge can be justified. And they're very different. There's conflicting views, there are different opinions. So this field is, interestingly, this late in history, it's interestingly still fairly diverse, with very little consensus. Okay, so, and one thing I think that needs to be mentioned from the beginning is that the scientific, secular, atheistic perspective holds significant sway within academia in general. So whether in science and philosophy, and even in theology, a lot of times theologians build up their own views in contrast with the atheistic views, trying to kind of justify themselves in contrast with the atheistic view. So there's anyway, this should be taken into account as we move forward. All right, now I'm going to focus on three distinct eras in just this covering the topic. So first we have pre-modernism, which at this point I'm just kind of qualifying as anything before the 1600s. And the key concept for pre-modernism is the form, Plato's form, so the ideals. Then we're going to switch to modern epistemology, which we'll label as going from the 1600s or the beginning of the Enlightenment period all the way to more or less the mid 20th century. And the key concept there is foundationalism. And then we have postmodernism, which usually has been viewed as being a form of skepticism or relativism when it comes to knowledge. Kind of like, well, we tried this way and we tried this other way and none of them work. So basically we can't really know for sure. We can't know anything for sure and so on. So that's the way people typically think of postmodernism. I'm actually going to use the word in a slightly different way to basically just represent this new era of approaches to knowledge where essentially we're trying to address the mistakes made by both the pre-modern era and the modern era. So the modern era, I have this pendulum here. The modern era was perceived as a correction to the mistakes made in the pre-modern era, but essentially was an overcorrection and the pendulum swung in the other direction. So now we're kind of trying to come back to a more reasonable position in contrast to both of these options. Okay, so we're gonna spend some time going over the history of pre-modernism in this video, and then we're gonna do modernism and postmodernism in future videos. And for the pre-modern era, the key figures are Plato and Aristotle on one hand, and then Augustine and Aquinas on the other. Augustine being more in line with Plato and Aquinas with Aristotle. And the key concept, again, for this segment of history is the form. So the idea here is that for any given object, there's some sort of form or blueprint or some sort of standard for that object that exists in an immaterial realm that dictates both how the object represents itself in the world and how our minds perceive the object when we try to look at it and understand it. So, I have a picture here of a person looking at this cube, and because there's some kind of form of a cube, the object I'm looking at participates in that form and has the characteristics of the cube, but my mind has some kind of link as well to this form and is able to perceive the notion of a cube because of this link between my mind and the form of the cube as well. And this idea of the form underlies the various models of human knowledge that exist before the modern era. All right, so before we continue, I'm going to do kind of a quick historical sketch with some of the key elements that happened over the past 2,500 years or so of history. And then we'll come back to the issue of epistemology and dissect it a little bit further. Now, we can say that philosophy proper started with the pre-Socratics in the sense that they began to ask certain questions that were later taken up by people like Plato and Aristotle. So at this point in time, the pre-Socratics are recognizing that there's a difference between people that know a lot, basically a lot of facts, a lot of information, and people that actually dig deeper than that and start to understand, behind, they develop a sort of depth of knowledge. They really, try to understand things as they are beyond just mere memorization of facts. And so now they're starting to think that there are things that are behind the appearances of objects in the world. So it's not just what we see, but there's actually something behind the scenes that we need to perceive and understand. The pre-Socratics are concerned with change and what makes it possible for things to change. What is it that allows things to change over time and yet still maintain some sort of persistence, some kind of continuity? There's also the issue of organization. How is it that we can organize things? For example, we can say there's such a thing as an animal, and then we have a horse here, and a horse is an animal, but a horse is a certain type, and there's other types of horses, but we know they're all horses, and they're different than maybe dogs, and we can categorize things. What is it that links them? What is it that connects all these things? And these questions are being asked at a time when people have no idea about stuff we have today. Like, they don't understand genetics, they don't understand how different things work within populations of different types of animals, and there's the ability to reproduce with certain types of animals based on their genetical similarity. People have no idea regarding the periodic table and how molecules are formed based on different elements combining together and having certain characteristics, the laws of nature and how they work in contrast with all this. So they're trying to make sense of reality at a time when they have very few raw materials to work with, and they're beginning to ask these questions. So within this context, we have Plato coming on the scene, And he introduces this idea of the form, or of I think of probably like just to the modern mind, the idea of a blueprint is more makes more sense in terms of what the form represents. So there's some kind of blueprint that dictates how objects in the world behave and act and look, and what they're composed of, and their all their characteristics. And by producing this concept of the form, Plato attempts to explain some of these questions that were being asked. He could explain how things change, because there's some sort of pattern that dictates how things could change over time, and how things work in the world. To Plato, the form is something that exists in a separate realm, in an immaterial realm. And the way to access knowledge about the forms is by thinking, by contemplating, by evaluating how things are. So it's more of a rational pursuit, in terms of how we can gain an understanding of this behind the scenes reality. But then we have his disciple Aristotle, who adopts some of his views, but then has also certain distinctions, certain differences. So he introduces this idea of hylomorphism, where the forms are not in a separate realm, but they're basically just components of the objects themselves. So any given object is composed of matter and of form, and it's not the form that dictates the nature of the object is not in the realm of itself, but it's part of the object. And the way Aristotle understands that we can learn and study these things, it's through sensory perception. So we're actually looking at the objects in the world and studying them, and learning about them by empirical analysis, as opposed to rational analysis like Plato. So there's some key similarities and key differences very early on. All right, so what we have is we have Alexander the Great, who was mentored by Aristotle, who begins the Greek Empire that essentially spread through a massive section of the civilized world at that time. Yeah, he conquered all these different countries and took the ideas of the philosophers with him and spread them everywhere he conquered. The Greek Empire persisted several centuries after him, even though it's split in different parts. Eventually was conquered by the Roman Empire around this first century BC, but the Romans appreciated the value of Greek philosophy, and they continued to preserve this sort of scholarly pursuit that the Greeks had begun. So even though a different empire took over, the philosophical thought of ancient Greece continued on. In spite of this, some of Aristotle's key writings were lost at that point in early history, and they were not rediscovered again till fairly late, over 1,000 years later. So a lot of the philosophy that happened within that era was dominated by Plato's thought, and only about a millennium later did we come back to some of Aristotle's ideas. So at this time, Christianity begins, and during the first century, it starts to spread. It spreads as something of an illegal religion. It spreads among the lesser social stratas, the slaves, the servants, the people in the lower levels of society. And the Christians are persecuted here and there whenever somebody decides that there's some kind of problem with them, and so on. In other words, it's not well accepted, but it's spreading quite fast, and it's affecting large segments of the population over the next couple of centuries. Coming back to philosophy for a second, philosophy itself went through several stages. So by 100 BC, we have something called Middle Platonism, which is a kind of a more developed form of Platonic thought. And then again by 250 AD, we have Neoplatonism started by Plotinus. That is kind of a new Platonic system that became prevalent at that point in time. So by the time Christian history develops, the first few centuries, Middle Platonism is dominant, then we have Neoplatonism come on the scene. By 286 AD, the Roman Empire becomes it's so large at this point that it becomes difficult to manage. So they decide to divide it into two different empires. So we have the empire in the east, and then the empire of the west. These are both huge segments, huge areas that are being controlled by the emperors, but it's not as big as it was originally. By 313, I believe, the Emperor Constantine converts to Christianity, and then about a decade later, the Christianity becomes the official religion of the empire. And so at this point in time, it switches from being a religion that is kind of on the outskirts of society and looked down upon to being the official religion. We soon have Augustine come on the scene, who initially starts off as a Neoplatonist, but then becomes converted to Christianity and ends up creating a system, of theological philosophical system based on Neoplatonic thought and Christian thought, developed into a sort of a synthesis between the two. So we have the Neoplatonic Christian system, and it ends up being such a well-organized system of thought that it ends up affecting more or less the rest of Christian history. Basically, everybody else after him kind of just continues on building on what he started. Another few decades later, by 476, the Western Roman Empire collapses. It cannot maintain itself with all the pressures, all the different people pushing in from the outside. Anyway, at this point in time, the empire kind of falls apart, and it ends up breaking down into different sections. Different countries within Europe start to develop at this point, but the empire collapses. And there's certain consequences that follow that, because there's a fairly high degree of stability that existed within the empire that was no longer there once the empire collapsed. Anyway, this has quite a significant impact on especially Christian history from that point on. So one of the effects of this is that there's a change in the Christian church in the West, especially in contrast with the Church of the East, because in the East, the Christian church is still under the emperor, and it will continue to be under the emperor for probably another 1,000 years. But in the West, there's no authority that kind of controls that entire region. So the church hierarchy, and especially the Pope, ends up becoming fairly influential in maintaining some level of stability and some level of joint leadership within the western part of the empire there. And because of this, this creates a key difference between how leadership structure, church leadership exists in the western part of the world versus the East. Then another 500 or so years later, you have the Great Schism, where you end up with the church ends up splitting in two, with the Roman Catholic Church in the West and the Eastern Orthodox Church in the East. And this continues on to the present. In terms of numbers, if we were going to put all of all the Christians in the world into a graph, we would see that Catholicism represents about 50% of all the Christians in the world, while the Orthodox Church represents about 10% of all the Christians in the world. So together, the two groups form about 60%. And then for the rest of it, you have about, I don't know, maybe 38% being Protestantism, and then whatever is left over besides that. But Protestantism is divided into so many factions that none of them are anywhere near as big as the 10% represented by the Orthodox Church. So in terms of, if we were going to treat them as denominations and compare them, the Orthodox Church would still be significantly bigger than any Protestant denomination. So yeah, that's more or less where things are out there. Then by the 12th century, as a result of crusades and other things that take place, people rediscover Aristotle in the West. The rediscovery of Aristotle has kind of creates something of a crisis in the West, because Aristotle, because of his empirical approach to knowledge, he provides the tools for people to better understand the world around them. And this is a useful thing to have. Essentially, like the Platonic outlook is to say, well, the world is something of an illusion. It doesn't matter as much. We don't really need to understand it because it's not real. While Aristotle provides the tools to actually study and learn things about the world, and to grow in knowledge, grow in scientific knowledge to some degree, because it's a knowledge acquired through observation. So the people see value in Aristotle's writings and they begin to embrace him, but it seems to create a conflict with the system, the Neoplatonic system that Augustine had developed. So at this point in time, during this time of crisis, we have Thomas Aquinas come on the scene, and he says, hey, just give me some time. And he goes through Aristotle's writings and systematizes everything. He creates a synthesis between the Augustine's Christian system and Aristotle's writings. And this system ends up becoming the dominant system, especially within the Catholic Church, and it continues to the present. By the 1500s, we have the Protestant Reformation. And the effect of this Reformation is that it ends up affecting the authority that the church holds over the different nations in Western Europe. So there's something of a collapse of the idea of church authority at this point in time. And then finally, we have the Enlightenment, and that begins the essentially it ends up kind of taking down any kind of religious authority, and we have a new system that is put in place at that point in time that we'll discuss in the next video. Anyway, so this is a very quick, very superficial overview of history with some of the key events that have affected things to some degree over the past 2,000 years. So now coming back to this idea of the form, this idea that there's some kind of exemplar, some kind of pattern, some kind of blueprint that exists that dictates how things behave in the world. So again, when it comes to Plato perceives that this forms exist in a different realm. And because of that, in his view, the way human beings access the forms is by recollection. And the reason is because our souls pre-existed our birth. And before our birth, our souls existed in the realm of the forms. So as we come into the world, we forget to some degree what we knew in the realm of the forms. But as we study things, as we contemplate, as we try to understand how things are, then we begin to remember the things we knew back before our birth. So that's Plato's mechanism for accessing knowledge. Now, Aristotle, because he's coming at it from an empirical perspective, and he believes that the forms are within the objects themselves, then the way we learn about these things is through abstraction. So we're looking at the objects and we're saying, okay, now I understand to some degree what this object is about. I've studied it. I kind of get a feel for how it works. And then I can deduce, based on its appearances, what has to be true behind the scenes within the immaterial form in order for the object to behave the way it does. And then this deduction, this abstraction that takes place goes up a sort of hierarchy of being as we move from simpler things to more complex things, all the way to the highest forms of existence within the world. And then from there, we can extrapolate to what must be behind the scenes, even to higher forms of existence, all the way up to God, who is the prime mover. And he sort of began the whole process and made the whole thing possible. So Aristotle's process for knowledge is by looking at the things that exist and that are tangible, and then sort of extrapolating from there to the rest of accessible knowledge. Plotinus, who developed the new Platonism in the 3rd century after Christ, he makes a shift in Plato's view of the forms, in that instead of having them in their own realm of existence, he places the forms in the mind of God. And this provides some level of stability, because there are different questions that emerge when you think about the forms, how basically that there's all these questions regarding does every possible object have a form? Is there a form for all the forms? And all these different things. But Plotinus places them in the mind of God, and that sort of resolves some of these issues that could exist with the whole notion of there being forms. So by the time Augustine comes, he adopts Plotinus' idea that the forms or the exemplars are within the mind of God. But then he has a different issue with this, because going back to Plato believed that we have access to the forms before birth. So our souls have access to the forms before birth. But Augustine doesn't believe that our souls existed before birth. So he needs another mechanism. And now that the forms are in the mind of God, how exactly do we have access to them? And he believes that we gain access to the forms through some type of inspiration. So basically, when a person becomes a Christian, they receive a sort of they're given some type of access to this knowledge because of the fact that they're Christian. I personally haven't looked at this far enough to know if Augustine believed that this inspiration takes place through some kind of new birth process, because Augustine did have a kind of a new birth experience of his own. And I'm not sure if he believes that that's when the inspiration took place, or if it's something that has to do more with the idea of infant baptism. So as long as somebody experiences the sacrament of baptism, then their souls are made capable of being inspired with this knowledge. I'm not familiar with that, how exactly he viewed that, but the underlying idea still is that knowledge to the forms is given to people through some kind of conversion. So knowledge is not accessible to everybody, but has to be, it's only accessible to people that are to Christians. Then we have Aquinas, and Aquinas develops what he calls natural theology based on Aristotle's view. And since Aristotle's view is empiricist compared to Plato's, he feels that there's some degree of knowledge that is accessible by everybody, and that's just accessible through studying the natural world. And then there's other knowledge that is only accessible through revelation, and that's the kind of knowledge that where Augustine's formula applies. So that's the kind of knowledge that you receive by inspiration, and there's other knowledge that you just receive by abstraction by studying the world. So there's certain implications that come out of all these different things, all these different views that developed. So first, because of the Neoplatonic view that the ideas or the forms are that the forms are ideas in the mind of God, God becomes kind of a cornerstone of human rationality. So everything else that takes place in terms of our whole understanding of how human beings develop their knowledge or gather knowledge, everything is rooted in it begins with God, and then God has the exemplars in his mind, and then from there you have human knowledge. So God is a cornerstone of the whole knowledge process. Then you have this breakdown that Aquinas develops where you have natural knowledge versus revealed knowledge. For the natural side, you have a movement from physics to metaphysics. And here I'm using physics in terms of the natural world. You learn from the natural world and you move into the immaterial reality that we cannot perceive, but you deduce things about the immaterial reality from the things you can perceive. So that addresses the natural part of knowledge. And then the revealed knowledge, the custodians of revealed knowledge are as the church. So the authority of the church becomes the conduit for that type of knowledge, because you have to essentially subject yourself to whatever the position is that the church had decided is the correct position at whatever point in time. And finally, one of the key implications of this process is the idea of certainty and the certainty of knowledge, because it's kind of like as you're trying to learn, as you're trying to understand things, you're working towards a standard. And once you've reached a standard, then supposedly you know that particular thing and you understand it correctly. So knowledge is moving towards something, and eventually when it gets there, then you have confidence that you have the truth. So there's a certain assumption of certainty. There's an assumption of confidence that you could have in what you think you know, because of this concept of the form that underlines this entire 2000 some year history of epistemology that exists there because of the concept of the form. Okay, so we'll end this here and we'll continue on with the modern era in the next episode.